Well, I'm going to review in this video how to factor when traditional factoring methods will not work. So this would be something like when the directions ask you to factor and find all real solutions to the equation, but you notice that it's not factorable. So if we look at the first quadratic of this equation, we see it's x squared minus 2x minus 4. And we can't find any factors of -4 that add up to -2. So if that's the case, then we would look for an alternate method for solving. Then once we get our solutions, we can work backwards to find the factors. So I'm going to review two methods for doing that. The first method being completing the square, and then the second method, quadratic formula. So on this side, we'll go ahead and solve the first quadratic equation. And on this side, we'll solve the second, and we'll use each of the two methods that we discussed in class. So I'll do a quick review of each method. Okay, so let's say I want to solve this by completing the square. I'm going to go ahead and move this 4 to the other side. So to do that, I would use inverse operations and add 4 to both sides. Now I left a space here because I know that if I'm using the method of completing the square, my goal is to make a perfect square trinomial. Okay. And so I need to find something that's going to have two identical binomial factors. So what would I do? I would add 1 to both sides. Now how do I know 1? Well, because I need two numbers that add up to -2 that are the same, and then those numbers would multiply to give me a +1. Okay, so if I were to multiply this out, I'd have middle terms -2x and then +x. Okay. Now, I know that this is squared because that's the idea of completing the square. So now I'm going to go ahead and solve for x. I'm going to undo the squared by taking the square root. And so I have x minus 1 is equal to, now don't forget that you have to count for both a positive and negative. Okay. The other piece is that we know it's a quadratic, and quadratics always have two solutions. And so we get that by dealing with the plus or minus. Okay, then I'm going to add 1 to both sides, and I have x is equal to 1 plus or minus radical 5. So now I have my two solutions, or my two zeros. My one zero is x equals 1 plus radical 5. My other one is x equals 1 minus radical 5. Okay, we'll stop there for a second, and we'll go ahead and work on the other side. Okay, on the other side, I have x squared minus 5x plus 5. Now, I might not want to use completing the square here because I have this 5 as my middle term. And I'd have to find two numbers that are the same that add up to 5. So it's like cutting 5 in half, which would give us 5 halves, and then I have to deal with fractions. So instead, I'm going to use the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula is x equals -b plus or minus, there's our two solutions, the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So that's your quadratic formula. So if I'm looking at this, I'm going to go ahead and identify my a value, my b value, and my c value, including their signs. So a is 1, b is -5, and c is 5. Okay? And then I'll go ahead and I'll plug them in to this quadratic formula. So anywhere I see a b, I plug in my -5. Anywhere I see an a, and so forth. So x equals negative of -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Now we said so far, if you get a negative under the radical, then something went wrong. After a couple of weeks, once we discussed complex numbers, then that might not be the case. Okay, so now we have x equals 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 minus 20 all over 2. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and combine what's under the radical. Okay, and then we'll re-express both of our solutions, okay? So we have x is equal to, let's say, 5/2 plus radical 5 over 2. And then x equals 5 over 2 minus radical 5 over 2. So now technically we have the solutions, which is good because it did ask us to find all real solutions. Okay, and then we're gonna also have to express it in factored form. Okay, so we're gonna take what we have here and we're gonna work backwards from that. So I'm gonna say that minus 1 minus radical 5 minus radical 5, and so what I have is x minus 1 minus radical 5. That's my first factor. Do the same thing for this, x minus 1 plus radical 5. Then over here, x minus 5/2 minus radical 5 over 2, and then x minus 5/2 plus radical 5 over 2. And then, of course, that's the factored form, and then we can say equals 0. Now, just like you could check your factors for any other problem, you can check these as well on the graphing calculator. Okay, so we'll turn it on. We'll go ahead and we'll store a value for x, and then we'll put in our original x squared minus 2x minus 4, and we're going to check to see if that's equal to its factored form, x minus 1 minus radical 5, and then x minus 1 plus radical 5. And we get true. So you can see that even ones that have unusual looking factor, you can still check those to verify that they are in fact accurate. Okay, so there's one more here if you wanted to try that as a way of studying or preparing for the test